and diversity are very important topics, and there's so many different things we can talk about. But what I'm trying to do today is just to put some kind of, practical sense and try to pose the questions about how we deal with the issues of diversity. Not linguistic only. As you can imagine, diversity is so multidimensional, multifaceted that when I give the list of the different aspects of diversity, you definitely can add a lot of from your own. But that's where we are, and actually, it's a wonderful opportunity to talk about it in Luxembourg, which is also the place where, is among the few places where the issues of linguistic diversity are important. People feel it, and I think it matters. So somehow, many years ago, people somehow didn't believe that linguistic diversity is an important thing, but I think it's recognized now that we have to think about these issues as well. And why I'm saying that is that the thesis of all this, what's happening is, on one hand, we are engaged in the process of globalization, but on the other hand, globalization is not a process which one-dimensional. People definitely say that globalization proceeds in English, but there are many question marks about that, and I'll talk about even about that. So diversity and inequality, I'll actually talk about both concepts there. Now, the first thing, and indeed, all my life is, I didn't plan it like that, but it's, I've been to different places, and maybe to some extent I do represent diversity of places, cultures, and different things. And the truth is that since I definitely work in many different places, different countries, the issues of cultural and linguistic diversity there are so important. I face it every day, and just in practical terms, going particularly from Texas to Moscow, you can imagine how different it is cultural. But even if you stop somewhere in between, it's also very different. Anyway, so when we start to talk about the diversity, well, diversity is a fact of life, and that's, I like these sentences when I saw in Kyoto, and not far from there, of the train station, that living together in diversity in learning to accept our differences. Well, so diversity is a fact of life, and the point is that definitely we have to live with it and to understand each other. But now when we start to try to how do we live, how do we understand each other, there is, this is a quote I also like, Robert Bateman, quite a famous Canadian artist, photographer, and philosopher, was saying that basically, some few years ago we thought that bigger is better, you cannot stop progress, no speed is too fast, globalization is good, all the things which point in certain direction, and then we somehow switch and say that roots and traditions are worth presenting, small is beautiful, biodiversity is a precondition from human survival. So what I'm trying to say here is, before we change the directions, maybe we have to think about it, what diversity means for all of us, for our lives, and for the way we conduct economic and social life. Is diversity good or bad? Well, even without formally defining, there will be no definitions, but examples, if you think about it, sometimes I I teach a little bit, not that much any longer, but when I teach, as I ask the students, even before you talk about diversity, first question, is diversity good or bad? Without showing all these things. And the different opinions. Of course, you can talk about examples when diversity is a good thing, with the people with different backgrounds. Silicon Valley is a nice example of that people with different backgrounds from Asia, Europe, everywhere, that they came together, and combination of different skills, talents, and different approaches brought to tremendous success of the development of the Silicon Valley. And some other examples, there is research in the United States and some other countries. Now, this is American research here, that the countries with the cities here, the cities with cultural diversity in many ways, they are more successful in developing, the technological progress and some other things. And there is support that in the United States, the cities with a higher level of cultural diversity prosper more than the others. Well, of course, there's the question of causality here, but anyway, that's the thing. So we can see diversity is good, different people, we help each other, we bring different angles into the same enterprise, different vision, different culture, and if we are capable of doing it together, to put it in the same plate, then we are successful. But the history shows it's not always the case. And if you really think, before I turn to the next page, that the history is full of examples when the people were killing each other on the basis of cultural, religious, linguistic diversity, and many examples of those. No, I will not talk about Europe that much, but there is the famous thesis, Easterly Levin, Tragedy of Africa, in a brief story. Africa is definitely known here, but the thesis was that the ethnic, linguistic, to less extent religious diversity of different African countries brought the very low level of development, and what we call the tragedy of Africa is basically lost generation of post-colonial development. An example which we usually give, it's not usually, there are many examples there, but an example is probably the most striking example is producing cacao in Ghana, when it was leading the producers immediately after, in 50s, after receiving the independence. So Ghana was having probably about 90% of the markets, of the world market of cacao. And then what happened is that after independence, the Kwame Nkrumah was the president of Ghana, but he was himself not from the area which produced cacao. So what he did immediately, and this ruling party imposed heavy taxes on the producers, and which reduced the level of production there. After some time, the other group, cacao producers, took power in Ghana, and then immediately they changed the tax structure and they abolished all the tax. So another change in opposite direction brought actually to this situation within 20 years from 90%, Ghana went to 0% of producing cacao. So, but examples, Africa is full of examples and conflict, all these things. So where the ethnic linguistic diversity really was negative. No, of course, the conflict, the ethnic religious conflicts, they are everywhere. Well, I don't know how do we classify now the current conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Well, I don't know whether it's between Russia and Ukraine, but it's also the conflict where different things. I don't know whether it's a linguistic conflict, but well, let me talk about Ukraine. If there's somebody asked the question, I will talk about it. But let's leave it. Let's leave it now. Yeah. So the microphones all over there. Yeah. And I still remember which country I came from. That's what. Yeah. But another diversity is, the African diversity, staying on the issue of the African diversity. We talked about Luxembourg, how diverse Luxembourg, 3 languages, 4 languages. Well, Papua New Guinea, 857, and you say 857, and that's really not, you say, okay, and so some grandmother, someone, some mountain speaks this language. It's not, it's active languages. If you count also grandmothers, it will be much larger number. So, but Africa, it's really, it's amazing thing, and it's really practically every country, not every, most of the countries have more than 100 active languages. So it's, diversity is such a thing. It's, you ask me, but every country is diverse. Well, I haven't been to North Korea. They didn't let me in. But I assume it is a homogeneous country. But even this I don't know because just a short example. Yeah, when first time I came to Mongolia, I thought it's a very homogeneous country. I mean, for me, when growing up and the way I was growing up, and I thought that's really the same Mongols there and a population of 3 million. What kind of diversity you can have there? When I came there, started to come there, I went quite often. It's tremendously diverse country, different languages, different ethnic backgrounds. So it's really not a simple thing. So until we see these things, so that's it. But what I'm basically trying to say that diversity can be sometimes a negative force, and the different people sometimes cannot communicate with each other. No, European Union, I will not talk about European Union standing here, but well, so the way is, at least, well, one of the approaches is that, at least the thinking that that's a growth of European Union to include different countries, and particularly inclusion of the countries from the Eastern and Central Europe with different languages, completely different linguistic groups. religion and different cultural approaches, including Bulgaria, Romania. So brought the country, brought the union to include so many different cultures and languages, and maybe, and we'll talk about it in a second, but maybe every organization, every union, every country has an optimal or maximal degree of diversity which it can sustain. Because if you pass this threshold, maybe living together becomes a difficult thing, and that's really the question here. No, well, if you talk about diversity itself, because I often rely on the linguistic diversity, but there are so many different facets which we deal with. And by the way, the center, I now part of the center in Moscow where we study different aspects of diversity. This is the list taken from our research project, but definitely there are many. You can think of so many different things. Religion is important, obviously. No, there is no argument. Historical importance. We actually deal a lot with historical diversity, and this is really a very important factor. Because without history now, I don't think we can explain that many things. So economic, obviously, no. Economic, ideology, geography. No, geography, of course, in context of Russia in particular. Well, we'll try to deal with these things. It's very diverse, and I flew to Vladivostok on Saturday from Vladivostok. It's 9 hours flight within the country, so it's different universe when you go there. No, genetic distances, genetic diversity, it's also a very important thing. And now, by the way, with respect to genetics, it's a growing literature and growing interest of scientists in economics and some other disciplines, trying to understand how genetic differences in population, how can they possibly explain different patterns of economic development, economic, social, and political development. And it's very controversial. This is probably religion and genetics that are two of the most controversial topics on this list, and as you can imagine. But actually, in the United States, I don't put genetic on my slides. And the reason simple, sometimes my colleague Victor Ginsburg, which has been mentioned, once was given a speech in Chicago and he put genetics on this list and he was unable to finish the lecture. So yeah, I think I can do it here, but in general, but it's also because of the interest, because emotions and other things which we can talk about it. But it's we do care about all these things. Religion also obviously important thing. So basically what I just going a little bit ahead of myself, what we're trying to do, and we say how can you deal with all these issues? So we can talk about it, yeah, history matters, genetics matters, religion matters, but what we're trying to do, which I will not talk about formulas or mathematics today, but what we try to do actually is to try to quantify even these things. We try to quantify religious differences, linguistic differences. It has been done for some time, and I will briefly talk about it. I'll show you the tables, at least the numbers, if you want to see some European languages. Yeah, how do we measure the distances? But religion, believe it or not, we can measure now. Sounds a little strange, but to measure religious differences, it's people try to do that because if you don't say anything quantitative, so that how can you proceed? But that's a lot of work here and a lot of things which we still don't understand. But nevertheless, so the question: what is the optimal degree of diversity? According to what we said before, is maybe there is some kind of degree of diversity which makes it impossible to live together. Maybe it's with respect to the European Union, maybe with respect to different countries, European countries, where diversity becomes so strong. So, but the idea is maybe a little bit diversity is good, but when it's too much, it's already not good. So some kind of intuitive manner you say, well, this is, in particular, maybe it's a Russian question, yes, how many spoons of sugar do you put in your tea? Well, there's different research, and in Russia they still put a little more sugar than in Western European countries. Yeah, no, it's not anymore, not 4 spoons any longer, but it's still more. But you see, the question what we're trying to say is, if you put a little, some people cannot drink the tea without the sugar, right? So put a little sugar, but if you put when you put too much sugar, then the tea becomes undrinkable. And so that's what the society, maybe some analog with the society, a little of diversity is good, and everybody probably everybody has to find an optimal level. Well, how salt is our meal, so that's how much salt you put in your meal. That's also the question. Some people cannot eat without, spices, and there's this type of the question. So really, you can rephrase all this, and how much color would we want to see in painting? So some people don't like it black and white, but some people also don't like too much color. This is the question of our individual preferences. So once again, the optimal amount of salt and sugar and paint. And going back to European Union, and that's of course the question is discussed. It continues to be discussed, in particular in view of the recent event, the degree of diversity, excessive degree of diversity. Maybe European Union at current structure, 28 countries in 24 languages, not including Luxembourgish. Yeah, that's maybe it's excessive thing. So, what is left for movements? What's the question is asked here is, can we really come up with some kind of reasonable discussion and definition of diversity, and then try to understand whether we can reach some kind of optimal degree of diversity which make existence of our organization, country, or the region possible. And this is the thing which we try to address. Why the study of diversity is interesting, important actually. Well, and let me just, you can read it, all of this, but what's important, when people are different, skills are different, attitudes are different, conditions are different, and we try to improve, we try to implement the policy for some countries, even if it's very successful, some kind of growth program, everybody is happy. Not everybody is happy. There will be regions, will be group of populations which remains on the outside of the main line of progress. So when you have something like that, even if the country prospers, there are some parts of some population segments which do not belong, so they are left behind, and as a result of that, it simply doesn't make any economical sense. To leave people outside. And when we talk about various types of disaster, different policies, not everybody is affected in the same way. So what I'm trying to say is this diversity, these differences should be taken into account when we try to design and implement the policy. No example of Obama healthcare reform in the United States. It's without any political implications. All this. What is the idea of health reform? There was that since 10 or 15% of the population are not covered, so these people do not participate in the process of creation, of contribution to the GDP, to the process there. So the idea is to try to bring the people, as many people as possible, in this process of creation and development. Well, how successful this reform was, but it's another issue. So the idea is that the differences between the people and diversity simply tells us that the people respond differently to different mechanisms, different developments, and we need to take it into account if we really want to sustain the progress. Now, another important thing here, and it's actually very relevant, the diversity is really not a static concept. You see, we talk migration, we talk about people, the demographic face of many cities in Europe and Eastern, Western changes over time. I haven't been in Moscow for some period of life. For a certain period of time, I was just shocked how culturally, ethnically diverse the city is. And so what I'm saying is that diversity is not something which you read, which you calculate this number and forget about it. It's a dynamic concept. It changes all the time. And really the challenge of the country, city, region is how do you manage these changes in diversity? And this is the thing which I really don't have time even to talk about it. But from our point of view, and when we ask about how do our recommendations, how do our findings, how can they help somebody, the policymakers, the question is really the management of diversity. So come up with the policies which respond to the changes in diversity. like in Moscow, an example of Moscow, the city may be about 18 million people now, to our estimates, and that's, well, I don't know, maybe between 4 or 5 million migrants, people who really come from different places. So in the center of Moscow, you have schools where the children do not speak Russian. In the center of the city. So, and it definitely happens in other places. But so the management of this diversity is in linguistic, cultural, ethnic, religious is a very important thing. So that's probably this part is not hasn't been taken care of sufficiently by the academic community. This was dynamic aspect, and it definitely needs to be addressed. No, and a bit about linguistic diversity itself. I will not go. Well, I will not talk about the Tower of Babylon. That's the story. This is the first example. There are many things. That's the story of linguistic diversity is old. And but what's maybe interesting now that we now have about 7,000 languages in the world and 300 countries. So if you divide 7,000 by 300 on average, it's a lot of languages spoken. That indeed Luxembourg would be, 3 or 4 languages. Here it's on average, so it's 20 something. Yeah, well. And the thing is that like religion, language does not lend itself easily to compromise. And the idea is that maybe religion and the language are so tied up with the self-identification of individuals that's why the linguistic issues become so important, and why sometimes it's so contentious. Well, this is example. I don't know, I have time, but it's King Richard, and when Thomas Mowbray was expelled to Venice. It was quite a famous story, forgetting about the conflict, and he didn't care that much about losing the status and this property. What bothered Thomas is that he was unable to speak language, so he was going to Venice, and he had to forego speaking English, and then all the story for those who is interested. Actually, at age 40 years old, he said he was dead as a man because he was unable to speak English in Venice. Probably was unable to speak in English in Venice in those days. Yeah, and this is how the people attach to their languages and to their native language. So it's there is many other things. There are many linguistic wars. I will not talk about it. I recently dealt with the war in Sri Lanka. That's we had to try to understand how the wars actually took place. But what languages matter? So now one word I will talk about: the measurement of diversity. No, for those, just forget about all this mathematics here. Basically what we say, how do we measure diversity? So suppose we divide population in several groups, and then we randomly took 2 individuals from the society, ask, what is the probability of these two fellows, or 2 ladies, or 1 fellow and 1 lady, to belong to different groups? This would be the measurement of diversity. If we have only one group that everybody is the same, then there is no diversity here. This is the index which has been used in linguistics in many areas. And actually there was a lot of research. Hundreds of papers have been written using exactly this index, A index, which is, but interesting thing, that I cannot pass on that Belgium around the corner here. So if you calculate this index, that Andorra becomes more diverse than Belgium. And the reason is that in Andorra have, roughly speaking, 2 groups, Catalan and Spanish. But then while Belgium 1640 Flemish and French speakers, Wallonian. So in the diversity index of Andorra is higher than that of Belgium. Well, that just doesn't seem right. And what is the problem here with this measurement is, what is the problem here? Somebody wants to tell me? Well, I actually don't have much time, but it's really straightforward. Catalan and Spanish, they're close to each other, really. While the Flemish and French, they are not as, actually they're from 2 different linguistic groups. So this calculation doesn't take into account proximity of cultural differences, linguistic differences, and that's what it is. Now this doesn't account, and that's as of course we go to when you want to do practical things. Italian, Venetian, the same language, Serbian and Croatian, Flemish and Dutch, Luxembourgish and German, but probably it's different language, right? Yeah, I didn't put it there, but it's probably a stronger case for differences in languages. Serbian and Croatian, it's exactly, I think, well, it's probably more political, because one country thinks it's the same language, while the other country thinks it's different language. So you can guess which one is it, yeah. So how do we, let me just say little numbers, because we say just only talk about this and that, but here are the numbers. So how do you calculate differences between languages? No, it's very simple exercise. You choose, not we choose, but it was chosen by linguists, 200 words, 200 meanings. And for every pair of languages, you ask, among these 200 words, how many of them are cognate or non-cognate, have the same root or not. So then that's a lot of small exercise for every language, and for every word you need to do this exercise. So a lot of graduate students were engaged in Yale University in doing all this without computers, or not much computers this time. But the point here was, indeed, for every two languages, you calculate the differences. No, if let's say 80 have the same root and 120 not, so this ratio is the same. Now let me show you. Oh, it's a little small, but for those who are interested, unfortunately, Luxembourgish is not official language. We didn't put it here. Yeah, I should have done it. But they're different. So there are many different things and many striking things. For example, Greek is here. If you look at Greek, it's a third line from the bottom. It's quite distant from all the other languages. It's 82. Oh, I can follow actually. It's 82, 84. So Greek is quite isolated in this regard. No, well, there are many interesting. Two closest languages here would be probably Czech and Slovak. Right, Czech and Slovak. Where is it? What here? Czech and Slovak 009. That's probably the lowest. No, well, that's what we do. No, so for those interested in recent Russian-Ukrainian conflict, here there is a number also. 22. Well, whatever 22 means, yeah. And well, it's simply I'm going to leave this diagram, but it's basically what it is. And if you look at the Indo-European, mostly different languages, the Slavic languages, Romance languages, and Germanic languages, and Greek is somewhere outside of all of this, Celtics and Baltic languages, and of course quite far, Finn, Hungarian, Estonian, and all the other languages. So this is basically the story here, how we deal with it. But what in terms of result, what do we know? And before, basically what economists do, and I just simply report on all these things. So on one hand, you just say, okay, let's calculate diversity of the country and ask the question, whether diversity is good or bad for business, for economic development, the different things. And what actually happens is that, in general, that fragmentation of diversity, ethnic linguistic diversity, has a negative impact on many things. So this was the first paper which appears in '95, Paul Mauro. Then he basically argued that the higher level of ethnic linguistic fragmentation leads to corruption and to decreases efficiency. And the reason here, the argument was, then you have many different ethnic groups within the society. There is a lobbying going on, and it's a lot of inefficient usage of resources of the country. So this really was the argument. As I mentioned, Easterly Levin, that's a seminal paper on the growth, which negative impact on growth. It reduces ethnic and linguistic fragmentation in general, reduces the quality of the government and investment in public goods, including education. Once again, fragmentation of the society leads to a lower level of investment in public goods. And this and this and that. So in general, sort of this literature, which was in 1990s and 2000s, basically said that diversity is not good from economic point of view. And of course, it depends here on quality of the regime, whether it's democratic or dictatorial regime and all those things. But in general, it was that. And that's interesting. That's finally we go to diversity. It's from Saborgnione, well, and the man who just contributed was the former chief economist of the World Bank. So basically what we say is, on one hand, ethnic diversity has a negative impact on growth, but we don't know whether the economic inequality, economic diversity has what impact on growth. And you think about it, some countries were very successful going through very substantial level of economic inequality. Some other countries try to bring to balance and to reduce this inequality. But from an empirical point of view, so there is no clear-cut evidence that economic income inequality is related to growth. So, but what really, where the literature goes now in this direction is, this is Ernest Arete is a president of the University of Ghana. Actually came to one of our fellows in our center. And so the idea, basically what we say, we talk about now ethnic inequality. So you cannot really explain anything by only one dimension of the thing. So if you want to talk about only ethnic things, this does not explain what happens in Africa these days. If you go with economic inequality also, it doesn't explain what happens in Africa and some other things. So what we really need to do now to talk about some kind of ethnic inequality, to combine these things, and that's what really is important. Now, you know, when we try to do some kind of interdisciplinary research, I just go often to meetings of interdisciplinary nature. So the people, if non-economists, they talk about the conflict, well, Russia, Ukraine, and some other conflict. So we try to analyze the conflict, how different the people are, how different languages, different religions impact, you know, we go history of the 1,000 years. But then you forget about it. But if the people eat, maybe the conflict would not be so severe. So whereas you cannot really separate these two things. On the other hand, economists talk about economics only. You know, say, oh, economic elements and this, but then you say, well, you cannot forget the culture, because for culture matters. So I think the challenge here is really to try to understand both sides. So if you look at the development, if you want to study something specific, you cannot really say diversity alone can explain this. Diversity alone, I don't think can explain it. Economic development together combined with diversity may say. No, there is, so this recent conflict in Ukraine, so because I discussed it recently, we have some forum, and the argument was that how all of this developed, but one simple thing, that if the development of Ukraine would have been, economical development of Ukraine would be much stronger and more successful over the last 20 years, maybe the severity of this conflict would not be such as it is today. So you see, there are differences. We don't deny differences between the people, but once again, so I think that's what we are trying to do, is to understand two things together. Economics matters, but culture matters, and that's what it's the challenge here is really to combine these two things. Do I have time? Where I'm on time? Done?
10 more minutes.
Oh, well, so let me just simply a couple of examples, and that's this is. What I'm saying is that here is to make the argument that what I mentioned before, that economic development, it's one thing, but cultural differences are people's feelings, so they matter also. If you look what I mentioned at the beginning, the globalization proceeds in English, but, and what's this quote? You know, here this says that globalization leaves too many invisible losers, too many people silence, and do you come from the place that does not control a language that commands respect? That's what I'm trying to say, is that even in the time of success and development, you really need to take care of the segments of population which have been left behind. So once again, economic development, one thing, but understanding that attitudes of different groups and different cultures. Well, this is also the war in Sri Lanka, and I think I just finished the example, which is a beauty of Indian example, which we try to implement. And now, actually, it's a Lisbon Treaty goes along the same lines. Here, this is the story of India, how they try to resolve their linguistic conflict. That's the people from the south and from the north, they spoke different languages. And let's say, for the sake of example, Tamils and Hindi, they spoke different languages. And there were many complaints from the Tamil part from the south that people don't get jobs because they don't speak Hindi. So what country did? Country introduced three-language formula, which is not difficult to. That's a very simple formula. So basically what was is that the people in different, so if you live in the south, you learn the language of the north. Of course, you learn your own language, you learn the language of the north, and English. So people in the north, they learn their own language of the south, and their own language. And this formula actually has been used in Nigeria, which much less a success. Well, I can imagine it's a more complicated challenge. But so what I'm trying to say, even over the last 50 years, the people try to deal with different type of challenges of linguistic diversity and deal with it. But in India, actually, the development of the movie industry actually brought the linguistic diversity to a different level. But it's a different story. But basically, my point here is that, as I mentioned already a few times, what we say is linguistic and cultural and ethnic diversity matters. It's a very important part of our life. And the point here is to manage in a proper manner and to combine it with economic development, which reflects the desires and ideas of the people in different segments of population, and then this balanced development, only balanced development can be successful. Okay? Thank you.